Welcome, Burr. I am Matthias Pfützner, responsible for one of our German blog posts that we do, which is under the name of opensorcerers.org. The interest that we have there is just putting everything together, what's with open source, regardless of the topic. We even will have at Thanksgiving later this year something about open source seeds, on how these things might work out. And you has been in Red Hat for quite some time, the person performing the demos during the keynotes of one of our most important events in the year, namely the summit. My idea today was to just talk with you about these things, what you've learned in the last years, what the topics had been, where you and how you have been coming in contact with open source. And with that, I sort of say, just want to hand it over to you to just introduce yourself a little bit.
Introduce myself. Well, I can start with the fact that I have such an odd name, Burr Sutter. And it has to do with the fact that I have a hybrid background. I am a biracial person from Hawaii. My mother was Japanese, my father from Georgia, Alabama, and Alabama area. And the Burr name actually comes from the southern portion of my family. My middle name is Kavika, which is from the Hawaiian portion of my family. And so already I have an odd name, and I've always had this kind of hybridized mental model because I lived in both worlds as a child. And I got to see the world of Alabama, especially in the 70s when it was still incredibly racially motivated at that point in time. And we're still dealing with the aftermath of the civil rights movement in Alabama, and in Hawaii, where the rules are completely reversed, as an example. And I learned how to program in Hawaii only because they had computers there. Didn't have computers in Alabama at the time, but they had computers in Hawaii. And I learned how to program. And the part that's interesting about that is when I got back to Alabama, I always went back and forth as a youth, right? Because I had family in both places. When I got back to Alabama and I was going to college, I realized at that point that my roommate said that you could learn this thing called computers and programming, and they paid you for that. And I thought that was super interesting because I already know computers. I know how to do that stuff. They pay you for that? Because back in the 80s, we had no idea they would pay you for this job. We really didn't, right? It was just, some weird people worked on those weird computer things. Everyone else got a job selling cars or doing insurance or, teaching school or whatever it might have been. Yeah, so I actually started in the soft programming world 86, 85. Now I think about it. And then of course went to school and graduated in 91, and then got a real job, programming at that point. My degree though is not actually in computer science or software engineering. It is specifically in MIS, Management Information Systems, which we offer both programs here in the US. I don't know if they do in Germany, but MIS comes out of the business school. So you learn programming, but you learn it in the context of building accounting and finance applications and HR applications and business applications. So I would say that my mental model has always been how to build business applications. And that has served me well over the last 30 years because invariably you end up working with a lot of people who are truly from the engineering side. And they're very interested in how to make the next compiler work or the next piece of middleware work or the cool framework and especially here at Red Hat, we have all those people that are working on the next framework or middleware or technology. And I'm always trying to figure out how to raise it up to the point where it looks like something a business might be interested in. That's probably where the demo was come from, right? Is trying to make all these little Linux technologies and Kubernetes technologies and middleware technologies come together. So it looks like something that a business might be able to take advantage of.
Yeah. So you basically have always been not necessarily on the infrastructure side of these things, but on the upper level. So the most important part for you was then, so to say, when Red Hat acquired JBoss, and we added a couple of products that allowed business applications to be built out of these components, or are we also looking at other business applications that were hosted on Red Hat Enterprise Linux? Because the world knows, so to say, that Red Hat started with a Linux distribution, and we added components to that later on. And I think that was one of my ideas here in our interview today, that you had been the person at the summits demoing all these additional features and making them applicable, or even, you so to say, transported the enthusiasm for all these components over and enlightened and inspired the audience. Whenever I asked somebody in Red Hat which sessions at Summit we need to watch afterwards, they always remind me it needs to be the session from Burr Sutter from the keynote, because he's the most energetic person over there. So how did it come that you really became the person to demo all these things at the Red Hat Summits?
I kind of fell into it like most things happen, but it actually starts for me many years ago, like literally 30 plus years ago again.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of when I was in high school in Hawaii,
mm-hmm.
this is I get back to the 80s again. I had a friend who basically said, he wanted to perform, and in our school at the time, they allowed performances from students. Yep. So you might go to the pep rally, and then there'll be someone doing a lip sync and a dance, or someone doing a whatever, any kind of performance, acting, drama. And the school was always encouraged that. And so I got really lucky. I got encouraged to do dramatic events and singing and dancing and all kinds of silly things because people thought it was great. People don't frown upon it. They thought it was cool at the schools I went to at the time. And so we actually a small group of us formed a male cheerleading squad in the 80s. And no one did this back then, right? It was very much not cool. Right? What are you guys doing? That's the girls' job to do the cheerleading. But we actually did that for my senior year of high school. So this is right when I was also learning programming, oddly enough. I was doing both things simultaneously. Yeah. And we actually put on some massive performances. I mean, I worked on choreography and presentation, and we practiced our butts off, rehearsed like crazy, and we just went out there and performed for the entire school of about 2,000 students. So I had big audiences back then, where you're out there doing some really scary stuff like backflipping through the parking lot and things of that nature. So whenever someone says, well, aren't you terrified of being on stage? I'm like, well, terror is relative. Mm-hmm. When you're in front of all your classmates singing, dancing, et cetera, that's pretty terrifying.
Yeah, it can be.
And even when it comes to big demos, even back in the 90s, I was working at a company called Progress Software at the time. Mm-hmm. And Progress Software was perfect for me because I came to the software development world with that mindset that you should build business enabling applications. And that's all Progress can do. It is an amazing technology for building business enabling applications, especially back in the early 90s when the world was transforming from what I call chewy character UI, right? The old green screen, amber screen, VT220, right, world into the world of Windows and GUI, graphical user interfaces, and event-driven user interfaces. Mm-hmm. And so Progress allowed you to work in both worlds at that point in time. Yep. So it was really good at that solution for building business database-driven, relational database-driven applications. And they actually had a demo shootout. And this I thought was very clever, and I actually think every vendor ought to do this. But they basically asked all the competing teams, basically pre-sales teams. I was in pre-sales, solutions architecture at the time. Everybody had to basically produce a cool demo, and then within their geography, they would kind of shoot out. And then we got to a global shootout in Orlando, Florida, of all places. So they actually brought the finalists from around the globe. And I think it was my team, we were the Southeast out of Alabama, Georgia, versus the Dutch. The Dutch they always won for some reason. I don't know why. Yeah. The Brazilians were always the most enthusiastic. The Dutch tend to win the game back then. But we won. And the final deliverable was in front of the entire audience of several hundred people of your peers, in this case, Progress Software people. And then you had to put on a show. And even in that case, it involved a dance routine, some drama, and a very clever demo application. And at the time, it was related for Atlanta, right? Southeast United States was about to get the Olympics. Yep. So this is early 90s. We knew we were going to get the Olympics. So we did this whole cool Olympic thing. And I can tell you the one big element that really got people was back then when you were doing Windows for the first time, you had the blue screen of death. And actually, before the blue screen of death, it was actually called a Dr. Watson. Mm-hmm. Right. And we actually had a little special modal dialogue that would pop up and would basically say, system error. And the only thing you do is hit OK and the system would reboot. Yep. And it happens so often in everyone's live demos that everyone knew it was going to happen. And I actually memorized what that screen looked like. And I went into Microsoft Paint and I repainted it. Mm-hmm. So it was a static image. Yep. So in the middle of the demo, we actually had a special hidden trigger that we would be doing, working, boom, dink. And then everyone on stage was acting. We were like, oh no. And then the whole audience was like, oh no, it was going so well. And we sat there for just a second to, looking at this big error window, thinking our whole presentation just blew up. And then of course I had the gag, which was, well, based on the fact we're using our special software, click the button and then it shattered and fell off the screen and we kept going on our demo. I call that the fake fail. And so you'll actually see some of those in some of our other presentations too, because that trick works to this day. People love the failure and the overcoming of failure. And it has a dramatic moment. So so for me, big time presentation started when I was a kid, right? And my early part of my career building apps in the form of demonstrations and form of highly competitive scenarios. And so when JBoss was acquired by Red Hat, which was 16 years ago, so 2006, at JBoss, we were already trying to do these demonstrations. Red Hat was not interested. For one thing, all they had was a Linux operating system, and you don't really demonstrate a Linux operating system. What do you see except a terminal, right, and some commands? You could demonstrate awk and sed and VI or something. I don't know. And but JBoss, we did demos because we were middleware. We could build business applications on top, and we had the SEAM framework. We had all the interesting JBoss, back then JBoss Cache and JBoss Messaging and JBoss App Server. We had a lot of things to work with, and much like the people at Sun Microsystems or BEA or whatever the day, we could do cool demos too. And we were doing JBoss World, and then we actually ran into a big problem. I don't know what year it was. JBoss World Orlando, so from 2007 or 2008. But the people who organized Keynote Demo, which was not me that year, they messed up. And I call it the naked baby demo.
Okay.
Because they didn't rehearse well, but they let, the demoers bring their personal laptop on stage. They wired it up to the AV system. And since they didn't rehearse well, they just weren't clean. And therefore, they couldn't even tell what laptop should be projected at any given moment. And that's one big thing that fails when it comes to these kind of presentations is what projector is on stage. They didn't figure that out, in which case someone had a screensaver on with his newborn child hopping around this, and was a naked baby. And so next thing you know, the whole audience is looking at naked baby photos and not understanding what technology is being presented, which all failed anyway, because they didn't rehearse and they didn't test it well. And so there was a moratorium on these Keynote demos at that point in time. They stopped. They're like, no more. And of course, the Red Hat people were like, oh my God, this is why we never do demos. Look at what those JBoss people did. It was a disaster. So we had like 3 years where we weren't allowed to do them until JBoss World, again, we got brave enough in 2010 to bring it back, where I basically went around to people and said, come on, we can do this. I'll do it. I just, whoever can help me, we'll come up with something, we'll do it. And they let us do it. And then we built up from 2010 to 2011, 2012 until Red Hat Summit, which was aligned with JBoss World, basically said, okay, put it on the big stage. And so we've been doing that ever since. I have to admit, though, these presentations are incredibly stressful. And maybe you'll appreciate this one comment. They're incredibly stressful because as of this moment, it feels like we've never failed. And these things always fail. Bill Gates demos failed. I watched him fail. I watched Steve Jobs demos fail, right? All of the big guys fail unless they do the video editing thing. They only then they succeed because they cut out the video of the bad parts. But otherwise, a live demo always fails. And we've not had failures, but that's mostly because the failures that we have had, we kind of anticipated them, understood them, danced around them live on stage. Because if you actually go back and watch some of the video, you might see me hurrying through some phases or changing things on the fly a little bit because things were failing at some point in time. But we were able to dance around it enough to get through the presentation. And but that does worry me even to this day. It's like,
but I think the most important part here is that people are knowledgeable in some cases and really see that it fails. And what makes it so intriguing to watch all these things is exactly to see how you then really work around these failures and what you are doing, and which is the part that makes it really engaging. So perhaps we might want to do some in the future, some demonstrations where we have some persons or people really introduce errors like pulling a plug or pulling the network plug. I think we saw that when I was at the OpenStack Summit once. Was it Barcelona? I think, where that was part of the demo. They just wanted to show how failures are handled and how the system itself or the application on top of these systems then really survives. So if we are looking at the infrastructure level, they somehow know how to handle these failures because it's part of the infrastructure. But in the business level, on top of this, that's normally not intended to happen. And therefore, the stress, as you've mentioned, is a little bit higher in having an application running all the time and not really failing during such an important moment like the presentation. So what did change in these years that you've been doing all these presentations there? Is there any notable change that you've experienced over the time?
The notable change over the last, I guess I've done about a dozen years of these things now, right? For Red Hat in particular. What has changed is the cloud has changed the way we think of the world. So for instance, I've been working on a demo as of yesterday where I am communicating from South Africa, Cape Town, to Tokyo. Because with the cloud, I have access to all these resources. So I've literally been working on a demo from Sydney to Frankfurt to Montreal, from Japan to Cape Town to Ohio, here in the United States. And I'm working on those failure scenarios with Scupper in particular, right? So basically trying to figure out how we distribute load, have bursting from cloud to cloud to cloud. What happens if this network line is severed? Can I communicate from the cloud back to on-prem? That's literally what I was working on last night. Was, how do I make my on-prem resources more visible to the remote hosted Kubernetes cluster? So the great evolution that has happened, a revolution in our industry, is the cloud. The fact that you have ubiquitous resources that are geographically distributed, that anybody with a credit card, and that's all I do is I go spin up all these things that I need. And I think that's absolutely amazing. And it's probably the single greatest impact, both negative and positive, to open source that we've seen in the last 20 years. Is this concept that the cloud makes these technologies incredibly easy to go touch for the very first time. If you want to try Linux, it takes you a few seconds to spin up a Linux virtual machine in a cloud provider, and you can go play with that Linux now. And as my case, I'll try 2 or 3 Linuxes just to see if they behave differently, and I have EKS, AKS, and GKA running sometimes. I have, and OpenShift. So I have 4 or 5 different cluster variants and 2 or 3 Linux variants running at any given moment. And I think that aspect is really what's changed our world for the better, right? It makes us all more productive, but it does make the world of open source a little bit trickier.
Yeah. So now that you've mentioned open source, what was your first encounter with open source and the philosophies behind open source, and how did it influence you?
So in my case, I didn't do the Linux thing like so many people did in the late 90s, early 2000s. I knew people who did. But my brain was wired for productivity, business application productivity. And at that point in time, Linux did not offer business application productivity.
Nope.
It was, something for hobbyists to play with and have fun with. And like, oh, look, it's like Sun OS, but it's not. Yep. I can run it on Intel hardware. I'm like, I'm good with Sun OS and Solaris. It works great for me,
I fully agree. I had been working at Sun in these days.
And I was using Solaris for my apps, right? And HP and AIX and all that. And those were fine because I was focused on the business application layer. So my entry point was about 2001, where I discovered this open source technology that was out of the Apache Foundation time. We had the Apache web server, which people were starting to use. But again, I didn't need Apache web server at the time. I was in the application servers at that moment, but I had the Struts framework. And so really it was the Struts framework that turned me on to open source. So that was where, again, it was a solution. I had actually built my own version of that for my own purposes, an MVC, model view controller style framework. And then when I saw that, I was like, oh, I don't have to rewrite this anymore. I've got one free and open source. And if I want to contribute to it, I can. If I want to try it with no licensing issues, no sales rep to call. And that was probably the biggest thing. I didn't have to call a sales rep. I could just download it on my own. I could try it, see if I liked it, and go on about my business. And I actually did a presentation for the Atlanta Java user group at the time on all the different things actually at the Apache Foundation I found interesting. Struts framework being the big one, but I think there was also another framework called POI at the time, POI, which was related to how do you translate things to Excel spreadsheets or something. There was another one related, or maybe it was PDFs. I can't remember anymore, right? But there was one for PDFs, one for Excel spreadsheets, the Struts, MVC. There's a few different things at Apache at the time. They were open source and for the Java community. And I just found that fascinating. And that was also at the same time that I then became the president of the Atlanta Java user group. I did my presentation. The current president was like, "Oh, you did a great presentation. Do you want to be president?" I'm like, okay. And, and so my involvement with the community in Atlanta at the time was kind of born at the same time I discovered open source. So really from the early 2000s, I spent all my time focusing on community, like actual community people and organizing events and talking to them about the fact that, you know what, if it's free and open source, you can go try it. You can go just use it. You can decide if you need it for your business applications, and at the time it was just exploding in the early 2000s and the Java community, all these different frameworks, all these different tools, all these different capabilities. And that's really where I got my start. And so, of course, JBoss was born out of that same movement. And JBoss, of course, kind of ate the universe at that moment. What, I can have an open source app server? I don't have to pay $80,000 for WebLogic? No, you don't pay $80,000 for WebLogic anymore. I actually have a slide I use in my presentations to this day that shows if you want to build a website, what a web application. We called it dynamic web apps back then, right? In 1999, you had to spend about $500,000 for Hello World. Now, because you needed the Solaris machines, and you always had two, right? You had a database machine and you had the web server. You had the application server, which was 80 grand from WebLogic or whatever. The database server from Oracle was the more expensive thing. I think it was $200,000.
And it still is, I think.
Yeah. And then you had even the IDE back then was $10,000 a seat, right? So it was $30,000 for your IDE, for your team. And so to get started, it was $500,000. And there were people over in Silicon Valley at the time bootstrapping all of that for you so you could do your startup.
Yep, sure.
Yeah. And so fast forward just a few years and Linux replaces the Solaris, right? MySQL replaces the Oracle, JBoss replaces the WebLogic. And now you're starting for free and, versus the $500,000. And now with the cloud, you're starting essentially for free and you don't have to wait for hardware to show up.
Still, right? You need to pay. Yeah, still you need to somehow pay the bill for the usage, but it's not fully for free. But looking back, even in those days when we had the software stack for free, the hardware was not completely free, so you also needed to spend something. But yes,
and the hardware was not free. But more importantly, the hardware required multi-month wait times.
Exactly.
That was really the gotcha. It's like, I had to wait 4 months for the hardware to show up and get configured and rack it, stack it, power, ping it, all that.
Yeah.
In my case, I would build out little things in my cubicle.
Yeah, you wouldn't run it back here in such an situation because the network might not have been surviving all the requests coming in and stuff like that.
Right.
Totally understood. So when we had been talking now about how you entered the world of OpenShift, where do you see the world of OpenShift going to in the next 15 years or so?
OpenShift or open source?
Sorry. Absolutely open source. You're right, open source. Because it's a broad spectrum, you're mostly covering on the developer focus and the human interfaces and stuff like that, and the business aspects. Any thoughts on your side where this industry is headed to?
The beautiful thing about open source, right, is it was in that enabling technology that basically made things free and frictionless. I look at those two words a lot, and I would use the phrase open source back in the day to essentially communicate to my audience. It's free, it's frictionless. You can download it right now, try it with no sales rep phone calls, and you can see if it works for your use case. You can basically trial the technology, evaluate the technology without ever hassling with a sales team. And I always thought that was incredibly valuable because I started early enough in my career where in order to evaluate products and technologies, and I did this for the Air Force at the time, my very first job out of college was to build systems for the Air Force. And so the Air Force, of course, is very regimented. It had a big RFP process, request for proposal process that would take many months. And I would actually go to magazines and look for ads for technologies I thought would fit our use cases, a database engine, a graphical, graphical front end, middleware technology, whatever it was at the time. And then you would have to call the vendors up from the ad, and then they would have to come do their dog and pony show, sell you their product, and then you would decide, go through the RFP process and make the bids, etc. So 6 months later, you might get the software you needed to start building your app. It was always 6 to 12 months later.
Yep.
And I always thought that was just nuts. It's too slow. Open source made that 0 months, right? You could go, instead of waiting 6 months, you could get it down to 0 months. But you had the hardware issues, and the cloud, of course, kind of solved sort of both, right? So that's what I actually see happening with open source right now, because the cloud is almost free, and even more frictionless.
Yep.
So it's the
Definitely.
even more frictionless that's now become more interesting than the dollar amount. Because if the
Mhm.
dollar amount is low enough, if it's $500 or $200 or $5 to try something, then okay, that's nothing, right? I'll spend the $500 if I need to, if I'm a large enough organization. But it's the fact that I no longer wait months, but I wait maybe 60 seconds
Mhm.
to try that new Kubernetes thing, to try that new database thing, to try that new networking storage, whatever it might be, Amazon Lambda or Azure Container Apps or Google Cloud Engine or what, there's all these great things that are happening all the time in the cloud. And I see that as a disadvantage for open source, because open source, which used to be the most free and frictionless, is now has something else that's also nearly free and even more frictionless.
Yep.
And I think that's a challenge for open source. And it's a challenge for organizations in the open source world, open source vendors like Red Hat and others, because the cloud providers will take that same open source technology, upstream technology, and host it.
Yep.
They'll host the Linux, they'll host the Kubernetes, they'll host the XYZ, whatever your favorite storage solution is, your networking solution, your middleware technology, whether it be messaging, caching, app servers, et cetera, and therefore there's less energy on the open source side, because the
Mhm.
cloud providers don't tend to contribute much, they just tend to consume.
Yep.
And therefore all your university students, all your hackers, all your weekend people, and all your Red Hat engineers, all your MongoDB engineers, Elasticsearch engineers, the people who work at Oracles and IBMs and everything in between, your GSIs, your large consulting companies, they might still be contributing to those open source upstreams, but it's the cloud providers that are benefiting more.
Yep.
They're able to monetize it easier, with just a credit card. And I see that as a negative pressure on the open source world as a whole.
Mhm.
On the positive side, I don't believe open source goes away, nor does it even shrink. It continues to grow, maybe just at a different pace, because the nature of community is still a key driving influence in any good open source project, in any good open source upstream. The very nature of community, where humans get together with other humans and they're there to empower and support other humans. And I always ask a lot of people, even at Red Hat, when they show me some new technology, we have tons of Red Hat people innovating on all kinds of ideas. And I will say to them, I said, great, you showed me your thing and it's cool. I think it's cool what you did, but where is my new superpower?
Yep.
I use that phrase a lot, that question. And the reason I do is because as a human, I might be willing to invest my time and energy to come learn your thing, to come understand your thing, maybe even use your thing. But that takes time. That takes an investment on my part. But I'm willing to do that if I get a new superpower out of it. I think that's true of all humans. If
Yep.
I'm willing to explore, but I don't have a lot of time. So if I'm really going to invest my time, because really at this point, time is the most valuable resource, in your thing, then I need to walk away from that with a net new, amazing capability, something I didn't have before. And open source has always enabled that. Like JBoss App Server was a perfect example. Instead of paying, $80,000 for WebLogic, I
Yep.
got something for free, and I can immediately build kick-ass web applications on top of that in Java, using JSPs and servlets and EJBs and all that back in the day, and put my Struts framework on it, and eventually Spring and dependency injection, all that magic that I gained out of the Java ecosystem in the middle 2000s was basically enabling superpowers for me.
Mhm.
And so that's how I look at it even to this day. And so as long as open source projects work incredibly hard on building their communities, enabling other humans, making sure humans serve humans, they're good. They're going to win. And you see that in the Kubernetes ecosystem.
Mhm.
The Kubernetes ecosystem, I think, is a beautiful ecosystem. The community is incredibly vibrant. Whenever you see them speak to each other, they speak at KubeCon, they produce videos, they write blogs, the CNCF people. Like, I don't know, have you met CNCF people you don't like?
No.
I mean, everyone I've seen and witnessed, it's like you kind of want to all give them a hug.
Yep.
And I think that's huge,
Yep, it
because at
is.
the end of the day, when humans serve other humans and enable other humans with superpowers, everybody wins.
Yep.
It's not a zero-sum game, right? It seems like in the cloud world, it feels like a zero-sum game. They want to kill each other, right? They want to best each other. But in the open source community, we all try to support each other. And when we do that, everybody wins. So I think that element will continue to benefit open source dramatically. We'll continue to energize open source ecosystems. Now, there will be plenty of open source projects that fail at the community building side, and therefore they'll just kind of fade into the background where you don't hear about them anymore, which I think is unfortunate because the technology might have been very innovative, very interesting. But if they fail at the community building, then no one will even know, right? What is that phrase? If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, right? Does anyone even know? And
exactly.
The concept of community building, I think, is even more important going forward.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. We're getting close to the end of our half hour, and therefore, just a question from my side. This year, we didn't see you on stage during the keynote, but the Red Hat internals know that you've been doing the preparation for all the demos at the summit this time. Will you continue to do the summit demos in the future? And how long can we expect you to be there for us and to energize us and to keep the communities vibrant with the superpowers that you transmit from the stage into the audience?
So for 2022, we switched the nature of Red Hat Summit. We decided to make Red Hat Summit an executive event. We wanted to be for the well-paid people who wore nice suits and basically made big decisions. And those people were there, and they're always there at Red Hat Summit, right? The vice president of this and vice president of that, and big bank and big government and big insurance and big airline. And and so it's important that those folks be there because they often make very large decisions around our subscriptions and the very nature of how Red Hat will monetize things in the future. But because we've switched the audience to a pure executive audience and a very small pure executive audience, I actually scripted myself out. I pulled myself out of the script, if you will. And while I worked with the people who were on stage extensively working on their scripts, rehearsing, so they could deliver a great presentation, and they did a great job.
They did, yeah.
I wanted it to be very much let's try to keep it as high level as possible. Take all the song and dance, if you will, out of it. That was not considered appropriate for an executive audience. And because my on-stage persona is so much associated with that cool, clever, innovative, developer-facing, user-facing content, and we were not dealing with developers and users and Linux administrators and automators, and those people weren't in the audience in theory, right? We wanted to deal with executives. I decided to pull the person who I am out of the script. And I think that worked very well. So the real question is, does Red Hat Summit go back to being inclusive as users, of all the people who made Red Hat great over the last 20 plus years, of all those people who adopted Linux and made Linux amazing and helped contribute to the vibrancy of that ecosystem, and of course the vibrancy we've seen in the Kubernetes ecosystem, and all the people who contributed to the JBoss and middleware and Java and all that ecosystem? If we get back to embracing users at a user event, executives are fine too. You can always kind of give them special opportunities at Summit like we used to, where they had special executive briefings and special executive cocktail hours and special executive, executives had to be treated differently. And they definitely don't want to see a terminal and code and all that stuff, right? So if we have a mixed audience again, then I think it becomes appropriate again for doing something like I did in my previous presentations, where it's, okay, let's show you this very cool technology. It enables a really cool business possible vision, vision of the future, as well as what users could gain in terms of capability. I'm always looking for that. What's that next new superpower for the user? And the weird part about an executive, I don't know what the superpower is for them, because their goal is save money. Number one, save money. Number two, do more. So that while they have to enable business functions, they don't really care about what technology is used to enable the business function. If you told them you could do it with Solaris, Oracle, and WebLogic, they'd be like, fine. So that's the nature in being an executive. And when I say executive in this case, I don't mean Red Hat executives. I mean the customer executives.
Exactly. I just wanted to say, Matt Hicks, now our new CEO and president, he started in Red Hat as an IT admin, even doing some software development. So we never know what the future CEO or executives might really come from and what perspective and background they have. So my thinking this year was a little bit, it's sad to not have you had on stage, because the opportunity that we had with the online version of Summit might have even be helpful in influencing other developers out there that might not necessarily come to an event like Summit. So depending on what next year will look like, depending on COVID development and stuff like that, I'm really looking forward to seeing you back on stage at Summit next year. And with that, I thank you for the time you've given us here today and given us the insight into the history of your presentations and Summit. And thank you, Burr.
Thank you.